for the kind introduction. I am Jane, as introduced, and I am very happy to meet all of you and very grateful for being accommodated to attend this session virtually. I would like, as much as, this is more of a training, but I would like for us to have it as more of an interactive session, because I would like to also hear your thoughts, having engaged with people in various platforms, and also meeting people who've experienced various forms of trauma on the ground. It would be very encouraging to hear your thoughts as well. So I would really appreciate it if we looked at today as more of an engagement on issues that are pervasive in our environments, in our communities, in our everyday lives. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts regarding this. So I will start by giving a short, very brief, it's Friday afternoon, so I kept it very brief, a brief talk on gender-based violence and how the nexus between gender-based violence and traumas and how these violate human rights in various societies. And then that will be our first maybe 40 minutes. And then in the next hour or so, we can engage on the various issues that people have faced, and also some thoughts you've been having, some questions you've had, perhaps around trauma for people who've experienced violence, and also maybe other forms of human rights violation. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I will stop my video so that we're able to see our presentation. Okay, are we good to go? At least, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it, Jane. Thank you.
Okay, great. So looking at gender-based violence, first we look at the definition of it. What is gender-based violence? And sometimes how does it differ from violence against women and girls? Violence against women and girls is a form of gender-based violence, but gender-based violence is not entirely only violence against women and girls, because we also meet people from other walks of life experiencing gender-based violence, males, for example, or even those people who not identify with any gender. So, but it is a violation. It is hurting someone, harming someone because of their gender, because of who they identify as, and the person who's perpetrating this violence not respecting that person because of their gender affiliation. And it is rooted in gender inequality, perceiving one gender as being more superior and another gender as being inferior. And then there's that power struggle between the genders. And sometimes perceiving a gender as non-existent, thinking, well, there isn't such a thing as being gender fluid, and someone attacking someone because they think the gender this person ascribes to is not legit, right? And it is sometimes also rooted in norms, in social norms, in communities. And these norms, we see them as being harmful. So according to UNHCR, it is a serious human rights violation, and we agree with that. And it's also life-threatening. And we'll see in our next slides how that is the reason there is that nexus between trauma and gender-based violence. And also, you're welcome to stop me on any slide as we continue. Like I said, this is more of an engagement, so you don't have to wait until the end of the presentation to ask questions or to share some thoughts. So what are the various types of gender-based violence? They present as sexual violence, physical, psychological, or even economic. And the last one is a highly contended form of violence, because most people don't believe that forms of economic violence are part of gender-based violence or should be perceived as a form of gender-based violence, but they are. And we'll see how that especially sometimes forces people or leaves people remaining in abusive relationship because they've been economically abused as well. And what does it look like? So we have rape, which will be a form of sexual violence. We have sexual relationship control, and that includes sexual relationship power equity, which is a big one. And we see a lot of this happening in African countries, where someone does not have a right to insist on condom use, contraceptives. Sometimes they're forced to use contraceptives as well, which in itself is a violation. And when people are forced, or rather are prevented from using condoms, we know that has implications in terms of HIV and STIs. So that in itself already, snowballs into other health issues. Then we also have stalking, and we've seen this happening in person, sometimes virtually, and sometimes even over text. Someone sending a text all the time, and you don't know who the person is, or you know the person, and you do not want to be contacted by that person, but the person persists. And then we also have physical forms of violence, like domestic violence. We have forms of FGM. We also have forms of forced vaginal examinations, where children undergo through this to check if they're virgins or not, and that is violence. And then we also have forced marriages, where a child or even an adult does not want to get married, but they're forced into marriage by either members of the community, by parents, by various people, and that is a violation. Then there is also the FGM, and although it is reducing, it is still very much a reality in most communities, and a lot of girls are facing it, and this has implications in their sexual control going forward into sex pleasure, and that is part of the reason that they go through the FGM, and that is a very serious form of gender-based violence, because it does not affect them only at that point, but it is something that they experience being perpetrated again and again every time they engage in sexual intercourse, because they experience it afresh. And while on the other hand, we have sometimes people being prevented from using contraceptives. On the other hand, we have people being forced to abort. They want to have the child, they want to carry the pregnancy to term, but they are forced to abort the child, whether it's by their partner, whether it's by family members, whether it's by members of the community. People have a right to make decisions on their bodies. And we see that sometimes women are forced to either abort or also forced to sterilize in a way that they can no longer have children going forward. And then we also have sexual harassment, which is another. We all agree that sexual harassment exists, but the various forms of sexual harassment are contended. Sometimes someone will say, I didn't even say anything to her, but the way you looked at the person itself is harassment. And or you say, I don't even think what I said was a bad thing. It wasn't a big deal. It's not about what you said. It's about how the person perceives this. Were they traumatized? Did they feel violated? Did they tell you not to continue telling them, whether it's the phrases, whether it's text you were sending them, whether it's the way you look at them? Did they ask you not to and you continue? Then it becomes harassment. And then this is a very sad one. Whenever I encounter this, I get very sad. But there's the honor killings, which happens especially in some communities where you are not supposed to engage in sexual activities before marriage. And if a member of the community finds that you have engaged in sexual intercourse before marriage, then the woman is killed, femicide. And we see this happening a lot in the Somali communities, but it's not exclusive to Somali communities. It happens in a lot of communities. So let's look at gender-based violence and trauma. And please don't forget to stop me if I'm rushing, or if you have any questions, I'm happy to stop at any point. So looking at the nexus between gender-based violence and trauma, it is impossible for us to think about GBV and not think about trauma. It's impossible for us to have that. The two are interlinked and the two go hand in hand. And the commonality between these two is that threat to life. Whatever form of violence someone is facing, gender-based violence someone is facing, even economic, there is threat to life in that, where a woman might think or a man might think, I cannot leave this relationship because of my economic dependence. And if I don't have money, of course, I will not be able to survive. So there's that threat to life. And threat to life is the core element of trauma. Trauma is that feeling of your life is threatened, either your life or someone you know, their life is threatened. That does cause someone to experience trauma. So in that way, in that sense, these two issues are linked together, and they have this vicious cycle where people who've experienced gender-based violence experience trauma. And because of that trauma, they engage in activities that put them at a higher risk of experiencing violence later in their lives. And that's why you'll see, according to research, people who've been violated as children or at some point in their lives are twice or more likely to be violated again in any other form in their lifetime. So you could have been sexually violated, and then later in life you experience psychological violation or economic or even sexual, right? So, but it is because of that cycle that occurs between GBV and trauma. So what are the traumatic impacts we see of GBV? These are not exclusive to experience of gender-based violence. It is, any form of a traumatic event will trigger these symptoms. But I did look at those that would be specific to GBV, or common rather, amongst those who've experienced GBV. So there will be anxiety and panic attacks, that feeling of threat. Remember, trauma occurs because there is threat to life. So, for example, if I experience a traumatic event today and perhaps sexual violation, and it ends, right? Next year but one, whenever I am re-experiencing, either I smell something, I see something, or I'm in a building that reminds me of that event, then immediately the anxiety kicks in. Immediately I feel like the event is happening again, even though it is physically not happening. In my mind, it is happening, and it is real threat. And you'll see people going into panic attacks because of that. And people around you don't understand, because you seem to be in a safe place. You're in a safe room, people around you, there is no one harming you in that present moment. But in your mind, that's not what your mind is telling you. Your mind is tricking you into thinking the threat is happening now. And we also see people who've experienced violence also being easily startled. So they are shaken a lot. When you drop something, they jump. When something happens, maybe a gunshot in the far distance, they jump easily. It's because they're waiting, that feeling of you're waiting for the threat. You know it's going to happen, it's coming. So anything that happens that is out of the ordinary makes you think the threat is happening now. Then there's the anger and irritability that often we are not compassionate to. But people who've experienced traumatic events are going through a lot of psychological discomfort. And these might also present in anger, in forms of anger, where you might wonder why. Whatever you said, you don't think it was something that should make someone angry, but you don't know how someone relates it in that moment to something else that triggers anger. Or you don't know what someone was processing in that moment, and what you say to them just compounded that and causes the person to be very angry. And you find people, especially immediately after the fact, being highly irritable. It's very, very easy to trigger this person into anger, into an angry outburst. It's because of that, that psychological, trying to process this trauma, trying to understand what is happening to them and why is it happening to them, and why me, and why isn't anyone around me understanding what I'm going through, right? Because that's the feeling of trauma. Trauma is a very lonely experience. Even when people tell you, I know you're going through a lot, they will tell you, you don't know. You don't understand. You're not living my reality. So it's a very lonely journey. And when you come and whatever you try to understand, or you also try to explain to someone their trauma, that person becomes very angry, which, by the way, we shouldn't. It's important to be empathetic. It's very important. But empathy is not trying to draw a picture for someone of their trauma. And also it's not us judging or reminding people when they should be or should not be traumatized. For example, I'm sure you've heard of this in various spaces. You've heard someone say, I don't know why they overreacted. It wasn't really a bad event. It wasn't traumatic at all. I was there and I'm fine. So I'm not sure why Jane is being dramatic about this. That's a word people like using, and this frustrates the person even more because whatever they're experiencing is very real. We do not see trauma. We don't get into trauma. We don't think and get into trauma. Trauma is a very physiological response. It's automatic. Our body responds to whatever it is that we're facing. So I have absolutely no control over that. I have control over the healing journey. I can choose to do things that work towards healing as I work with my therapist. But I have absolutely no control of how fast I get healed, also of whether I get traumatized or not. Even when you know all the definitions of trauma, all the manifestations of trauma, you still cannot control trauma as much as you cannot control a sneeze or a cough. See, then there's the disbelief. Often we don't believe things are happening to us. And you'll find sometimes people coming to you to tell you, I know I'm not traumatized, but I'm experiencing this and this, and I'm not sure it's how I should be feeling. And I'm not sure where it's coming from. I'm not this angry person. I've never been an angry person, but I'm angry. And when you dig in and you chat to the person and you later find out they experienced something that was traumatic, and they will tell you, no, that was years ago. And I'm not even angry about that. I don't even think about it. But this is what I'm experiencing. And especially every time I walk through that building, I get very angry. That's because trauma also occurs at a very subconscious level. You don't know where it's emanating from, but it is happening. But we are often in disbelief because, according to most people, trauma is for the weak. But we are strong. I'm a strong person. I don't experience trauma. That happens to other people who are not as strong as I. But that's not the truth. The brain is an organ that we don't fully understand. Then there's also the emotional numbing, where someone tells you they're fine. And maybe they believe they're fine. Maybe they're sure that they're fine. But that's because the brain does not even want to start to process the traumatic event. It's too much. We are only able to process trauma as much as we have the faculties to do so, as much as you have the capacity to do so. If it is too much, then you emotionally numb. And for children especially, they almost never process trauma. So you'll see it later on in their lives. You'll see it manifesting in various ways, but they never process that trauma as adequately as possible. That's because they are way too young to fully understand it. And we also see it happening in adults, where someone is emotionally numb and they don't want to, or rather they cannot process that. So they don't believe it when you tell them, maybe that was a problem. No, they can't go, and they'll tell you that was not an issue. Okay, sorry, Rupian.
Hi, Jane. Thanks so much. I was actually wondering, so this stage that you are describing now, what physiologically, where is the person at? Because it's not amnesia, is it?
No.
and you were talking about the capacity or the faculty to not comprehend, but to deal with the specific traumatic event that had happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm trying to sort of understand, you know, in terms of the, I can't say phase, but where in the experiential range, you know, from the time that the trauma happened, subsequent, like post-trauma
Yeah.
phase, you know, where is this at, you know, and how long does it take for someone to actually get out of this, to get towards or move towards the processing of it, the healing process? Because if you don't deal with it, you cannot heal. So
Yes.
yeah, that's sort of just what is coming up in my mind. You know, like a question that is coming up in my mind. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I like your question, especially when you ask, how long does this take? So the emotional numbing occurs immediately after the event. So when you start processing the event, it's rare for someone to go back into emotional numb unless they've gone into a different phase of that trauma. But mostly it occurs immediately someone has experienced the event, and it could last for a day or two or years. I have met someone who, I think we saw her 7 years after the trauma had occurred, before this person ever processed that trauma. And we have also seen it in children who experience a traumatic event maybe at the age of 7 and they never talk again. And possibly they only speak again when they're 17 or 18 or later on. That's the only time they're able to process. So it depends on at what point does your mind move from that form of disbelief or denial, I would say, not wanting to think about it, to the point of wanting to think about it even the tiniest little bit. And there's always been, and this is something we talk about a lot with Kempi, there's always that debate of, should we bring someone out of that, or should we leave them in that? Is it safer to leave them in that state of it being emotionally numb because we can see it? Or should we bring them out of it sooner so that they can start their healing journey, as you so well put it? And we still don't know, because it is like a Pandora's box. Sometimes someone comes out of the emotional numbing, and instead of processing the event, they go straight into coping mechanisms, and some of them are very harmful, like alcohol use or substance use, or engaging in risky behaviors like driving recklessly, you know? So we are never quite sure about it. Others sometimes want to address the trauma, but they are scared to step out of it. So once you nudge them slowly out of the emotional numbing, they start the healing journey. So it's a very tricky and risky position to be in, especially if you're the therapist at that point, or if you're the counselor, for those who do that. It's really a very tricky point for them. But sometimes it's possible to start the healing journey, right? So we started processing the trauma. Maybe it was sexual violence. We start, and maybe we deal with a certain aspect of it. And then you see, when you get to another point of discussing about the trauma of the event, the person goes into emotional numbing. That means the brain can't process that. So it can happen either or, but often once someone starts processing the trauma, it's rare for them to go back into a state of emotional numbing. Sorry, I think I saw your question. I hand up again, Fabian.
No, you know, when you were saying about nudging them out, you know, because I'm thinking about a specific case now, and it involved, you know, the person being drugged, and I'm not sensing any change. You know, the person is really going in it on and really wanting to continue with the academics and so on and so on, you know, like really, I don't know if it's even, I think there's disbelief, but
Yeah.
also just going into um, denial to some extent as well, you
Mm,
know, and so just continuing and pushing in terms of the academic and you know, academic assignments, exams and so on. And I'm so concerned that the person would crash, you know, like
mm,
something will trigger and that person crumbles, you know. And so for me, it's interesting what you are saying, that, you know, each one deals with it differently.
yeah.
And the extent of that is absolutely unique to where the person is at, you know. And so we cannot measure ourselves against another person who might have experienced something similar
Mm,
and expect ourselves to behave and respond in exactly the same way, you
yeah.
know. So I just wanted to just reinforce what you are saying, is that you are unique in what you have experienced, and so your body will and your mind will process it when it is ready, you know.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. And there's something you said. Oh yes, about pushing on with academia and in academic assignments and all that. And you're very right in saying that the person might crash at a very crucial point, even maybe in the final exam, and not be able to finalize their studies. But it's an unfortunate reality that often, even in counseling, the person might crash at a very crucial point, but all you can do is wait for it. Also, interestingly, some people will cope with the trauma by doing something like academia or like writing books. So it could also be it is unhealthy though, because it is hiding behind something else so that you don't deal with this that you don't want to. And we see that happening often. And usually what we do is we wait until the person decides or is ready emotionally. Because once they decide they want to get help, that means physiologically, their mind is not ready to deal with the trauma. Now they're ready to talk about it, they're ready to process it, and they're ready to go through healing. Because the other sad reality about healing is that even if you are not emotionally numb and you're forced even into counseling rather, and you go in, if you're not ready to heal, if you're not ready to work in that session, then you will never get better. So that's why, like Rubian put it, it becomes a very personal journey that we all experience. And I also like what you said about people experiencing trauma differently, because this is something that people who've experienced trauma are often stigmatized for. Why are you being dramatic about this? It wasn't a big deal. We just saw a car crash, the person didn't even touch her. The person just told her, you're dressed, you look sexy today. And she was triggered. But it might not be perceived as a big deal to this one person, but to this other person, it is horrible. It's a horrible experience. They're highly violated, and they have a right to feel the way they're feeling, and they have a right to respond the way they're responding. Um, yeah. So, and we also see people feeling shame when something has happened to them. Well, they shouldn't feel shame, but they do feel shame. It's almost like it's their fault. It happened to me, and they don't want to talk about it because they feel exposed. And even when people are looking at you because they like the pants you're wearing or they like your dress, you feel like the entire universe knows what happened to you. And and you feel shame for that. And you find people pulling away and hiding and detaching from people and hiding away, just so that they don't expose their shame to people. And the self-blame is very common. I like dwelling on that a bit. If only I hadn't walked at night. If only I had waited 5 minutes before walking out my door. if only I had left the office 5 minutes earlier, or even not gone to the office today. Something had told me in the morning not to go to the office. I had that feeling that I shouldn't go to the office. Then I went, and this happened. If only I had paid attention to my intuition not to go, then this would not have happened. Well, we know that's not the truth. And people get violated in the comfort of their home, the safety, the one place you feel really safe. Well, most people feel safe in their homes, and they get violated there. So it's not true. It's not a true narrative that if you had stayed home, you'd not have been harmed. But the mind likes control. As human beings, we like control. We love knowing, if I do this, this will be the repercussions or not. So we love that sense of control. So by blaming myself and thinking that if I hadn't left the house, this would not have happened, in essence, I'm saying, if I never leave my house, I'm going to be safe. And that is not true, but that is what the mind is doing. The mind is trying to control the trauma, the narrative, so that you don't feel out of control. Because if you feel out of control, it means that there is trauma everywhere, including in your house, and you cannot survive then. You can't leave, right? So we need to know, where is it that I can be safe? Maybe in my house, maybe in my church, maybe in my sister's house, my mother's house. That is the safe place, that nothing will ever happen to me. And that is why most of the time people blame themselves. Sometimes people are blamed, but often when something has happened to someone, they start by blaming themselves one way or the other. And then when other people blame them or say things that seem blaming, that only adds to that. It compounds on that. Why were you? And it's as simple as asking, I'm so sorry this happened to you, Jane, but I'm just curious, why were you walking around at night alone? So maybe you're asking out of curiosity, but what you're telling me is, had I not walked around at night alone, this would not have happened to me, which is not true, because there are many people who are walking and that hasn't happened to them. It's not advisable to, but it doesn't mean that because at that specific time I was walking, that's why I got violated, right? And that's why we see people engaging in obsessive compulsive behaviors. I'm going to check if I've locked my door 3 times, every time, just to make sure, just to be extra sure that I've locked my door, just to be extra sure I've locked my car. So we see them engaging in various compulsive behaviors, washing their hands excessively to wash off the dirt, showering 3 times every time to make sure they wash off the smell of that person. Right? So we see people engaging in those obsessive compulsive behaviors as a coping mechanism. And also often we see people detaching not only from other people, but also other people's emotions. And you will encounter sometimes people who are very angry, who are inherently very angry people, or very brutal, or even violent. And that is because they have already detached, because of what happened to them, the trauma they experienced at some point in their lives. They detached from other people's emotions. The reason we are not, or that I hope we are not hurtful, we don't hurt people, is because we empathize with how they feel. How will it feel if I slap someone? It feels horrible, so I'm not going to slap someone. But if I don't perceive the terror the person will experience if I stab them, then I'm able to stab the person without remorse. So when people experience traumatic events, they are more likely to detach from other people's emotions. And you'll find that research in South Africa, especially by Soraya Sidat from Stellenbosch University. They've done a lot of work on trauma in South Africa and complex trauma. Why are South Africans experiencing a lot of complex trauma? It's because of the various forms of traumatic events that are present in the country, right? Straight from childhood all the way to adulthood. And you find that because of the traumas people experience as children sometimes, and they detach emotionally, then they're more likely to perpetuate violence and other traumatic events to other people. So then there's that vicious cycle of trauma recurring over and over again. And when they impact that, they traumatize someone else, when that snowballs to other people. Yet they themselves are also experiencing other forms of trauma. Yes, Rubian.
Yes, I'm so enjoying this talk of yours.
I'm glad.
I'm just wondering, the South African society,
Yeah.
we've got a heck of a history, and because of the legislation, the way in which people were dehumanized, right?
Yes.
With that comes some level of trauma, right? And
Yeah.
I'm just thinking now, I'm relating that now just in terms of the general populace. And then I'm thinking about Bongani's masters that he did, yes, where he went, he interviewed rapists that have been convicted, and he asked them, if this had happened to your own family, your mom, sister, whoever, that's a relative of yours, that's close family, they actually said they would really harm that person and would even kill that person, right? But they could not relate in the same way to their victims. They did not see the victims as persons. And I was actually just wondering if that speaks to this detachment that also happens, that individuals who are perpetrators, I'm not saying that all of them are victims or of trauma themselves, but how is it that they are capable of not seeing the victims as people that they are harming, that could have been that is actually a family member of somebody else, and really just seeing that person as an object, it was just this parallel that sort of came to mind, that was what he found, that they did not relate to the victims as human beings, actually. It was more like objects to satisfy themselves than somebody else's child or sister or mother or aunt or whatever, so yeah. So I just wanted to make that observation, and I wasn't sure if, in terms of this, you're talking about the traumatic impact and that there is a detachment from other people and emotions, because there was one instance, he said, where the guy had, there was some kind of empathetic kind of behavior towards the victim, which was not the case in other instances of other individuals that he had interviewed. It was more like the exception to the norm than the norm itself. Yeah. Okay. That's it from me.
That's very interesting and important that you raised that, because there's some work we did it wasn't my work, I wrote on it, but some colleagues conducted the research in informal settlements of Durban. And we found that people who'd experienced childhood trauma in their childhood, they were twice as likely to perpetrate or experience violence, sexual violence, right, in their adulthood, experience for women and perpetrate for men. And so when we were trying to understand that in one of the discussions, we found that for men, when they were kids and they watched their father hurting their mother, and sometimes also sibling, because it goes hand in hand, domestic violence and corporal punishment of the children. But for them, they had a need to protect their parents or their mother and their sisters and siblings. But on the other hand, in a very contrasting way, they understand why the father would harm the mother, because the mother is not family to the father, the way they processed it. So the mother is, just someone else, just someone you meet, like a partner you meet along the way, but you cannot harm your own blood. So it's a very, it's a very distorted way of thinking, I'd say. But to them, when they're hurting other people, like non-partner violence, people they meet on the street, these are not people. The only people we are considering here is my own family. So I will protect my family. But when I go out there, those are not my family members. That's the community. And the community out there is, out to get me as well. They're out to harm me and all that. So they become the enemy, and they're happy to, well, not happy, but they're willing to hurt these people. And also impact, because they do have that urge, because of what they've been socialized to harm people, they've been socialized to victimize women and girls, then they need to, they want, or they have to do it, right? But they cannot understand why that would happen to their own child, and their own sibling, but it can happen to their spouse. They're happy to also impart it on the spouse. Yes, Vivian?
That is a very interesting finding. I think it actually explains what Bongani had found in his what I just mentioned now, that they cannot relate to the individual as a person. It's more like seeing that person as external, like an external entity, and therefore they can do with that person what they want to. Is there, you mentioned socialization, and how they were, is there a link between, and this is now on, you spoke about the violence that were observed and so on.
Yeah.
Is there an element, and I'm not sure, possibly in your research, that you found in terms of gender roles, and socialization in terms of what men are expected to do, what women are expected to do, and how that plays itself out, in the relationships that you participate in as you grow up and as an adult, in your intimate partner relationships and so on.
Thank you. I'm so glad you asked that, because I think that is something I missed at the beginning of this talk, in terms of gender norms and gender roles. I think I just, brushed through it, but I think I should have explained further on it. Thank you so much. In that, so gender norms will be those gender inequitable attitudes where women should, right? So women should be submissive. Women should listen. The man is the head of the household. The man also has a right to keep the household in line. And if you don't fall in line, then you should be punished to go back in line. So there is that gender norms. And if a woman questions or asks why this should happen, questions the husband rather, or the partner, then they should be punished, because that is not their role. Their role is to listen and follow, right? And we see this happening in many communities. And if the woman comes out and says that they are being abused, sometimes we see other women, right? And this was some work they did in Rwanda, and they found other women will remind this woman that she sort of deserved what happened to her. They are accepting of women being physically abused or sexually even, because, so for example, sexual abuse within marriages, we know most communities don't believe in that. Your husband cannot rape you, right? We know it happens, right? We know husbands can rape their wives, but in most communities that does not happen. Once you're a wife, that means the husband has got a right to have sex with you, and you have no right to refuse. So if you come out and say you're being sexually violated by your husband, even your fellow women will tell you that is not possible, it doesn't happen. And this will be the gender inequitable attitudes in the community. The community has got a belief system, and they believe that also sometimes the husband can punish the woman in the community, right? So you can't come out and say you're being physically abused by your partner. So those gender roles of how you expected in the household. The woman should cook. The man should make sure children are well fed, they're well dressed. The husband is well kept and all that. So those expectations, when the woman does not fulfill these roles, then they should be kept, brought back in line. And the community sometimes endorses this and says it should happen because otherwise you're an embarrassment to the community as well, right? So those are actually at the core of gender-based violence. So I like that, Ruby, and you raised that. They are what is the key driver of gender-based violence: gender inequitable attitudes and gender roles. Because if you look at all forms of gender-based violence and how they occur and manifest, what is the key driver, or what's central to it? It's the man is in power. There is that power dynamic. The man is powerful. The man should take what he or she wants, what he wants rather, right? Sometimes we do see the women violating men, although it is not, well, it's not disproportionate. We have more women being violated than men. But that power, when any human beings feel that they are in power and they should take what they're entitled to because of their place in terms of the power hierarchy, that is the core, that becomes the core of gender-based violence. Whether it's a woman violating the man, because sometimes we have the woman is maybe the breadwinner, does everything in the house, and the husband is perhaps unemployed, maybe it's the one staying at home with the kids, and the woman will violate the man sometimes, right? And the man might not speak out about it because at this point he feels powerless, right? Well, it is not often. We have one out of three women being violated. So that statistic is quite high compared to the number of men being violated. But what Rubian has raised, the gender norms, gender inequitable attitudes, they are the foundation, the core of gender-based violence. And if we can dismantle that, if we can work on that, I think we will have solved the puzzle. Unfortunately, we have been unable to do that because these are embedded within communities. They are the core beliefs of the community. So unless you're able to engage the community into understanding that the gender norms that they have are harmful towards their health and socialization and well-being, then gender-based violence will remain pervasive in that community. So yes, they remain at the core. I think that was the one question that Rubian asked. I don't know if there was something else that you said that I think I wanted to follow up on, but I think it's gone. So yes, that remains the core of gender-based violence, gender inequitable attitudes. So when people ask, or when people say, for example, alcohol does not drive violence, that is not true. But we are not saying alcohol causes violence. We are just saying it is a driver of it. So for example, we know that what alcohol does, it reduces disinhibitions. So for a man or a woman who holds gender inequitable attitudes as a belief system, when they are not inebriated, when they're not drunk, they are able to stop themselves, right? Control their thoughts. They're able to control their behavior towards the member of the opposite gender. But when they take alcohol and their inhibitions are reduced, then they lose control of their actions and their behavior. And their core belief system, which will be the gender inequitability, comes to the fore. At that point, they violate, right? So there's always been that contention where we say, if possible, try to, when you drink, have your glass of wine, have two even, but try as much as possible to be in a safe place when you're doing that. And at the same time, only drink to the point where you still are conscious, where you still are in control. If you feel the more than one glass is too much for you, take water it down. Because the problem is that as much as we want society to be free of this, it is not. And the reality is, once people become inebriated, when they have too much alcohol, when they're drunk, and then their fundamentals come to the fore, and some of them hold these gender inequitable attitudes, they will harm someone else. So I hope I've created that distinction between the two. So we don't say that, we're not saying that alcohol is the cause. No, the cause of GBV, at the very core of GBV, is gender inequitable attitudes. Alcohol is just one of the drivers. Alcohol, substance use, all those are some of the drivers of GBV. Sorry, I was trying to remember something else Rubian said, but I think I've forgotten it. So I'm just going to carry on, but it was very important. Okay, so we also see these other forms of traumatic impact, such as extreme alertness, because the person is worried about what will happen to them. They're always on the conscious, they're always on the lookout. They want to be aware of danger so that they can control this before it happens to them. There's that overwhelming fear. If I can pick danger before it gets, if I'm alert and I'm able to see the trigger before it gets to me, that it can't harm me, right? And we also see people avoiding activities and places that remind them of events, not just activities or places, even smells. And this is how sometimes we are able to pick that a child was violated or someone was violated as a child. They will tell you, I cannot date a man who wears this cologne. Every time a man who wears this cologne comes near me, I suddenly feel scared. My guard goes up or I get nauseous. And then we know something happened sometimes when they were a child, maybe not remembering, or maybe they're numb to it. But then they're being triggered by that fragrance, by the smell of smoke, by maybe an aftershave or roll-on, and they're being triggered by that. And then sometimes we find that, and this is very, very common amongst people who've experienced sexual violence, we find them experiencing agoraphobia, where you want to stay home. You don't want to go outside because remember, home is safe. So they feel safe in that space, whether it's their home or someone else's, and they cannot go outside the door. This is very, very common. And that's because they are trying to protect themselves from the trauma that is waiting for them beyond that door. Well, we know that is not true. I mean, trauma can find you in your household, but that is the coping mechanism that people employ to protect themselves. Okay. So, and these are the human rights that intersect with violence. There's the very main one of life. Your life is threatened. Your education as well could be threatened because sometimes when you've experienced violence and you're not able to attend your lectures, you're not able to finish your assignments, you're not able to even go to school because you're staying home. You want to stay home. You don't want to go outside your door. Your right to education is being violated. There is the movement. There is the speech. You don't want to say some things because you don't want to trigger the wrong person. You don't want to be seen in the wrong place because you don't want the wrong people to see you. Then they violate you. You don't want to associate with a certain group even. We have had women who cannot join women's group because, or the various forms of associations that they have, organizations they have, because your partner does not want you to join that group or to associate with that group. And so we have women being controlled to isolation, and they're alone. They cannot associate with anyone, and they experience this violence by themselves in silence, and it never ends well. Then, of course, all forms of violence are torture, but we have the FGM and the forced vaginal examination being extreme forms of torture, and the sexual violence itself is torture. The honor killings that we experience, that we see people experiencing, are torture, right? And which reminds me, someone asked me, and I think I'm going to leave this to the floor. When someone texts you where are you? Or what are you doing? Is it all the time during the day when your partner texts you, what are you doing? Where are you? What are you up to? What are you going to do today? Is it a form of control? Or are they loving you? Right? Because that is a very interesting question that a friend of mine asked in her research. And it has different understandings in different contexts across the world. But I want to hear from the floor maybe. When someone is texting you all the time, asking you these questions, do they care about you? Is it a form of caring and checking up on you to see that you're safe, that you're well? Or is it a form of control? And why?
For me, that question is usually, it's the type of question that is usually based on the type of relationship that the people have.
Mhm.
Because I would notice that the only time that a person finds it a bit controlling is when their relationship is rocky and they're struggling. Then they deem it as deem the person as controlling. But however, if the relationship is more on the healthy side, whereby they check on each other on a daily basis, they don't feel threatened, it is usually considered to be a form of care or some part of the love language. I can't say there's really an answer to that, but it just usually depends on how the person views their relationship at that moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And can it get controlling then? You know, say my partner and I, we always checking up on each other and seeing how we are doing, how your day was, and all that. At what point should I get worried? At what point does it become controlling?
I'd like to think it gets controlling to when it's at the point whereby should you communicate that, then the person gets agitated. It causes a fight when it was just maybe you were busy that day, you couldn't get back to them. I think then at that point you may consider that it is that.
Yes. Thank you. I think I saw another hand.
Yeah, okay. I think it also gets controlling when if I don't answer or if I don't like respond to the message, then my life is in danger. Like he will hit me, or there's verbal abuse, or like if I don't answer you, then I'm worried that he's gonna flip out. Then that's controlling.
So I think what I'm hearing, the common theme here, what I'm hearing is it becomes controlling when I feel controlled. You know, when I feel threatened, when I feel this person could harm me for one reason or the other, or when I feel I don't have freedom to do certain things for his reasons or for her reasons, right? So, and that is the thing about trauma. You experience life differently, you experience things differently, because in most Western cultures, you don't ask them what they are doing or where they are. They find that very controlling, even in very healthy relationships. Why? Why are you asking me where I am or what I'm doing? I'll get home when I get home. But in most African cultures, when someone texts you at around 6:37, they ask you, where are you? It's getting a bit dark. It's mostly perceived as a way of caring. He cares about me, that I'm still not home and all that. And we can easily misconstrue that, because if you tell your American friend that your partner always checks up on you at 6:30, you're like, are you sure you're not being controlled? That's a bit controlling, don't you think? But the key thing is, it's how you feel about it, how it makes you feel. If he feels, even if at the middle of the day he texts you or she texts you to see how you're doing, and maybe it was out of care, but you feel this is making you really uncomfortable, then you're being violated. And obviously you make the person know, but when they continue, of course, then it becomes an issue. But that's a very interesting thing that I always like asking people. Because the first time someone asked me that, I was also puzzled. I wasn't sure until they really got me to think about it. I thought it was actually sweet at first that someone would check on me, up on me and see what I'm doing. I thought, oh, that's sweet, you know. I never really thought about thinking about the way it could easily be a form of violation if it crosses some lines. Okay. So we've come to the end of the presentation of the session, but I would really like to hear from you, from what we've discussed today. Any questions you have, any clarifications that you'd like, or any issues that you'd like to bring to the fore. I think this is the one part of the training that I really, really love. And you're welcome to do so.
For me, it's just a comment on one of the points that you made about trauma being something very individualistic. It's actually an individual's experience the same thing, and assuming that everybody's gonna have a certain reaction. So that was a good point to bring up. It will make everybody more conscious of the type of things they say towards people who've experienced some form of incident or trauma. So that was quite an interesting point, as well as the one whereby you said people are always trying to, if they've experienced some form of trauma, they try to avoid things that trigger or that can trigger flashbacks or that can make them recall what the incident was like. So I noticed you mentioned something about disassociative behavior, where they subconsciously are not aware that they're trying to get rid of it, but they just don't want to acknowledge it in their mind. So that was quite interesting for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think one thing I like reiterating to people is that everyone has got a right to feel the way they do. But the society's way of thinking is to sort of box our feel because they want you to heal faster. So you have even people with the kindest of intentions, the best of intentions for you, just pushing you to get better. Come on, this happened 2 weeks ago. Get over it already. We don't get over things. We don't even control our own healing. We can take measures and take steps towards healing, but we don't control it, right? We go through the phases, we go through the journey all the way to healing. And sometimes there are setbacks. You could go all the way and you feel, now I think I'm healed, I'm better. And then something triggers you and you go back to square zero, right? And that is okay. That is very okay. And nobody should tell you, I thought you were better now. What happened? No, we're going back. I mean, is it the attention that you like? Did you like the attention that you were receiving when you weren't feeling better? So, but that is not the truth. And you should always make sure when the people you encounter who experienced violence, please let them know or be empathetic and advise them that it's okay. And if you've gone back to square zero, we're going to start again, all the way to your healing, right? And this might be a cycle that might happen 2 or 3 times, and that is fine. They do need that. But as a society, we like rushing things because we like immediate gratification. So we want you to get healed today and now. And that is a very common thing that I face all the time. I see people saying all the time. Yeah.
Hi, Jane. I think for me, it's I think I'm taking you back to the presentation, but you started off by showing us the different forms of GBV. And I think for me, what I'd like is maybe for you to probably put emphasis again or share with us again specifically the financial and emotional form of GBV, because I feel like because those are not immediately visible to the naked eye in certain instances or to other people, they're not picked up quite late, or people don't actually identify that, okay, maybe the relationship that I am in is I am being abused here. Because when you think GBV, you think, okay, sexual violence, you think physical violence. So if he's not beating me and if he's not raping me, then I'm not being abused. So I think maybe just for me, and maybe for the room, for some of us that didn't quite get that part, please could you just take us through that part and the indicators of those types of abuse or violence? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think I will start with the economic, because we had a meeting last week about, we were discussing a certain study, and we kept insisting on how this should come to the fore, the economic control, forms of control, because it's very difficult for anyone to listen to you when you say you're being economically violated. You're experiencing economic violence from your partner. It's very difficult for people to understand what you're saying. And so economic violence occurs, for example, when your partner controls your expenses. So you go to work, you bring your paycheck at the end of the month, and your partner will decide how you spend this money in the household. Before you do your hair, before you do your nails, before you buy anything else, the person has to endorse it. The person has to agree to it, right? So that is the one way where you have the money, you come home with the money, but you still have no say on how you spend it. Then there's those times where you're not allowed to go and make this money. You can't work. Why? The other partner is providing all the money. And I'm saying partner, I'm not saying husband or wife, I'm saying partner, because it happens either way. And but I am making the money. I make the most money in this household. One of us has got to stay home. And so we don't need your money. But when I bring my money, I still control how we spend it. So this person is not economically independent in any way. This partner controls all the finances in the household. And sometimes it's usually one of the form of violence that occurs with other forms of violence. Because if you're physically violent towards this partner, they can't leave because they're also economically independent on you, right? They're quietly dependent on you. They need you, you're their upkeep. They can't buy anything. And the terrible thing about violence is that when you experience it for so long, you feel defeated. You feel helpless. When someone tells you, maybe you can go out, but if you leave, you could get a job. You can't perceive that happening because you're fully dependent on this person. Without this person making the money for you, you're unable to make money for yourself, right? So economic violence occurs, but it is often downplayed. People don't believe it, or people don't pay attention to it, and people who don't listen to survivors who are experiencing economic violence. Then the other one you spoke about was the emotional violence, right? And sometimes partners don't hit their partner. Sometimes they don't even sexually violate them, but they belittle them. They make them feel worthless. And they shout at them, right? Verbal abuse. And they emotionally scar this person to the extent sometimes suicide, where your partner, without me, you're worthless. I don't even know why I married you. You're an embarrassment to this household. You're an embarrassment to your family. You're an embarrassment to the community. I'm doing you a favor by even being seen with you. I don't know if that makes sense. So this person is emotionally scarred and they feel worthless. And we know that the key drivers of suicide is hopelessness and helplessness. So when this person pushes you to a point of feeling helpless and hopeless, then unfortunately the person could be driven to committing suicide. But mostly it drives emotional abuse. It drives someone to stay in a relationship because they feel the partner is doing them a favor by the mere fact of being their partner. It's a favor. They make me better. This person is doing me a favor. I am nothing without them, right? So by being with me, they are making me seen by the world. But I, as Jane Dungu, I am not worthy of the world. The world does not see me. I'm not even worthy. If that makes sense. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you so much, Jane. Is there anyone else in the room? Okay, we have another hand there.
I have a question. Let's say it's an abusive household, right? And let's say the man, unfortunately, sorry guys, the man hits the woman all the time, and at some point she starts hitting back, right? Do we say that is self-defense or is now mutual abuse, or does mutual abuse exist at all?
It does. It does happen. It does. Mutual abuse does happen, but it depends on how it is occurring. So, for example, if someone is hitting me and I defend myself, then that is self-defense. But if I'm hitting back, I am abusing this other person, ain't I? Because I've hit this other person. So it becomes abuse. It becomes mutual abuse in that way. It could also be, I am the breadwinner in the household and my partner doesn't work. So he physically abuses me and I economically abuse him. So I don't bring the money home at all, right? I don't provide for him in any way. So it could be mutual abuse. It could also be that we abuse each other in different ways. But it could also be that in that moment I was defending myself. And that's why we see sometimes women being acquitted when they shot their partners. They were being abused, they've been abused for so long, and one day they just took the gun and shot someone and they become acquitted. See, I'm not advocating for shooting people's brains off, but I'm saying it does happen, and sometimes it's in self defense. You're welcome to follow up with that. If I'm not sure if I answered your question, but you're welcome to follow up.
It's just that lately in the social media, there's this famous case that has been happening, Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. And it was an argument of whether mutual abuse exists at all, or if it was just self-defense on her part, because she started hitting or like verbal abusing him back at some point. So
yeah, it's unfortunate because okay, so remember one thing we said, that at some point after experiencing trauma, you dissociate from other people's emotions. So I see how we can perceive the partners, the one who's being abused, their actions of fighting back as them fighting for themselves. But remember, we always have the option to leave, right? So it's not always possible, because sometimes people don't think they can leave or don't have the capacity to leave. But there's always that option. But I could also choose to fight back. But the moment I choose to fight back, it becomes a form of violating the other person. And it's quite unfortunate, because the world will not. I, for one, also struggle empathizing with a perpetrator. I must admit, it's something I really, really struggle with. But every day I choose to remind myself that there's also a human being, and I need to think of where they're coming from. Sometimes they are victims of the circumstances. So in those moments of weakness, when I'm not empathizing with the perpetrator, I will very much cheer for the partner when they're fighting back, when they verbally or physically abuse the partner. So I can see how it can be a way of fighting back, but it is also a form of violating this person, because what does it make the partner do? What happens in that space? The partner becomes traumatized and they go ahead and perpetuate more trauma. So that is the downside of that. But in that case, I would say, or rather I think, it was mutual abuse. And it doesn't make me happy to say that, because I also empathize with the person who's been abused.
All right. Thank you very much. I have a comment and also a question. I come from the old school, where when you are faced with challenges that concerns matters of the heart, one tries to find a coping mechanism. Now, I was touched when you raised a point around the fact that it is possible for someone to start a healing journey without processing the traumatic experience. And I am a living example or a testimony of that, because due to my past life experiences, because I didn't want to focus on what was happening to me at the time, I decided to refocus my energies and do something else. So that when I think about the past life experience, I can say, okay, fine, it was bad, but look what I got out of the bad experience.
Mm.
However, the negative thing or a disadvantage about that is that the issue or the experience, it is still there waiting for you to process that. So on the other hand, you may be achieving, you know, in life or progressing in life, but you still have something that you need to do to deal with that traumatic experience. And I'm grateful that at least I'm almost over that past life experience, because I got to a point whereby I needed to face my demons head on. And I know it's not always the case, like to the next person, but it's what normally happens to us. Then my question is around the fact that in a family setup, let's say you have siblings, the females to be exact, they got married, and one of your siblings is experiencing what we have just touched now around the economic one, where back at home she was sent to school so that she may be able to take good care of herself and also be a blessing to her kids and the family. But if he gets married to this to this type of a person who believes that a woman must not be employed because he's a man, but in the process you realize that this one is suffering, and it's not that she's not capable of going out there and secure employment. However, because I am the man of this house, you will take my word, I am the one who will provide for the family. Your duty is to raise them. Your duty is to make sure that food is prepared and all that. How do you assist someone who is in that situation? You can see that the person is dying on a daily basis, and you can see that should the other one be outside of her life, or maybe should the other one dies, it will be too late for that one to go out and seek employment.
Yeah.
Because the reality of the matter is that we all know that we will die one day, you know, but prolonging now that process in the name of, you know, being submissive, you know, for me, because I'm on this side, it's easy for me to pinpoint things. But for someone who is experiencing that, it's very difficult for that person to see that. So how can you advise in terms of how can I deal with that type of a situation? Because it's a real life situation. And it's not nice when you see your blood going through that. And unfortunately, that bulb is not yet, you know, switched on. But when you are with that person, she can see that, okay, fine, you care. She can see what you are saying. But when she goes back, it's a different case. Thank you.
It's a very difficult question. You know, I'll start by saying that I am so glad and I'm so grateful that you've managed, or you found ways to cope and deal with the trauma that you experienced. I'm very happy for that. It's like it's a win, right? And then to your second question about observing, watching someone experiencing trauma and not being to help them, it is the most helpless situation that one can be in. And I empathize with you. Yeah, because the same also happens domestic violence, where you can see someone is getting hurt over and over again, and you talk. Hey, you sit and talk about it. We see the point, and we even plan on how the person is going to leave. right? And then they go back. And we feel angry. We feel that you don't want to grow. You don't want to get out. You are doing this. I am trying to help you. When you don't listen, right? But it's very difficult for this person to leave. Remember, once someone becomes violated over and over again, they become very helpless in that situation. And that applies to both men and women. They feel helpless and they feel controlled, and they feel that this person owns them. So, in order for someone to break those chains and walk away, it is the most difficult fight of their life. And unfortunately, we can't pull them out. We wish we would, but we can't. But what I always tell people is keep talking about it. Don't be silent to it. Keep vocalizing it, reminding them, I wonder, what are your fears? Because I know you're not happy. You say to me, you're not happy. What are your fears? Why are you not able to leave? What are you scared of? And the more you keep reassuring them, once they share with you their fears, the stronger they become. But is it easy? No. Is it going to take one talk? Maybe not. It's going to take a long time. I have had people even help their siblings out of an abusive relationship where they're being beaten to the extent of being hospitalized. You even rent the person an apartment. You support them financially in all ways, and they go back, right? We see that happening. And you can't understand why this person would go to an abusive relationship, yet you have even set them up financially and in a house, safe with their children. But we have never fully understood the form of control or the extent of control someone experiences in order for them to remain in those abusive relationships. But one thing I can tell you, abusive people are very controlling. And once you get into the grasp of an abusive person, it is very difficult to leave. And they make sure that you never leave. And so unfortunately, some of people, when they leave, they end up being hurt or even killed. We've seen femicide. But some people, the partners are not even going to harm them, but they just control them in such a way that they cannot live. They cannot perceive life outside of this relationship because they've also been reduced to feeling worthless and helpless. So they need this partner. Unfortunately, this person abuses me, but they also love me. And remember, also because of social norms, sometimes there are times, and we've heard this, that women say, he beats me, but it's because he loves me. In fact, I have heard this, and I'll share this with you. I've heard somewhere someone say, the only time he paid attention to me was the time he hits me. That's the only time he paid attention. Other times I'm non-existent in the house. So in that way, when the partner hits her, then she feels seen, she feels loved in a very psychologically distorted way. And it's that in a way that it is difficult for us to comprehend. But for them, that's how the mind works. Like I said, the mind is a very powerful organ that we haven't fully understood how the brain works. But that does happen. So to answer your question, it's hard what you're dealing with. It's hard for them to leave. But all I can tell you is to encourage the person over and over and not to get tired, because it is easy to get tired, but don't. One day they will make the move. But it has to come from them. They have to decide on that day, I am leaving. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I wanted to know if all these types of abuse that you have named supported in our legislation, in specifically economic abuse. How would one go in reporting economic abuse, or would they have to wait for it to develop into verbal, emotional, physical abuse in order to report it?
Yes, they are provided. They are provided in not only the national laws, but also WHO, UN. recognizes all these forms of violence. But the trick is what you've raised. Can they be prosecuted? Because, you know, it's always the burden of proof. How do you prove that you're being economically violated? Because you'll say, he does not allow me to work. And you know how lawyers can be sometimes when you go to the legal system is brutal. It's not it's not a space for emotional processing of things. So it's a matter of fact. When we go to the legal side of things, it's fact. He doesn't allow you to earn a living. He doesn't allow you to maybe spend your money. He doesn't allow you to divide your money in your household. Then why are you staying? Why aren't you leaving? Because if you're saying you're being abused economically, but this person has not locked you up in the flat, why aren't you leaving? So that means you're not being violated. Otherwise, you'd not be there, right? So it's usually a very difficult form of violence to prove. Because if I'm going to report physical violence, I'm going to show the bruises. If I'm going to report sexual violence, I'm going to provide the specimen for that, right? Then there's tangible proof. But when you're reporting emotional violence, psychological violence, and economic, proving it is very hard. So it is provided, but sometimes, most of the times, it's very difficult for people to go to prison for economic violence or emotional violence, unfortunately.
And another thing, what I've come to observe is that usually economical violence is usually accompanied, they usually fall into each other, is usually accompanied by psychological abuse as well. And you would have people asking the very same question of why didn't you leave? And it's in cases where there's children involved, the woman would have to say, I couldn't leave because if I left, then my children wouldn't have food and all those things. And it's a majority of the time, economical independence is always an issue. They never just go alone. They always spill into each other one way or the other. So yeah, that one is a tricky one. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it is very tricky. And it just reminded me, so my sister did this study where she was looking at why do economically independent women stay in abusive relationship? Because most of the times women will say, I stayed because I know I couldn't provide for the children and all that. But we have really well-off women, executives, earning 6 figures, but they are in abusive relationships and they don't leave. And they ascribe this to other reasons, such as social norms. I can't be the one from a broken household. You know, women, we like our households being intact. We like perfect homes, right? Children going to private schools or children being in university, and perfect husband, perfect house, clean house, and all that. And sometimes you don't want to break that. You don't want to be the divorced woman and all that. So sometimes there are other reasons people stay in economically or rather in abusive relationships for an economic reason, which was a tangent from what we were discussing on, sorry, I took a tangent there from what we were discussing on economic violence. But yeah, and also to add to what you said about economic violence being co-occurring with psychological violence, economic violence also co-occurs a lot with physical abuse and sexual abuse, you know, other forms of abuses. Because if I'm economically dependent on someone, then it's very difficult for me to escape a physically abusive relationship because I need the money, right? I need to provide for the children. So that becomes quite tricky. And there's something else I wanted to raise in that I fully understand and empathize why people stay in abusive relationship. It's very difficult to leave, you know, first off, it's a very difficult situation to leave. And sometimes people stay for other reasons like communities, like I don't want to be the divorced woman that the community will shun me, they'll stigmatize me. But the impact of children growing up in an abusive relationship are very expensive because children who grow up in abusive relationship, according to research, end up either experiencing violence themselves or perpetrating violence. So while you're staying with a child in that abusive home to protect them from the stigma of coming from broken homes, you are exposing them to the trauma which will render them vulnerable to experiencing or perpetrating violence later on in their lives. So the thought of my daughter being abused throughout their adulthood or even teenage is, I don't know, it's very scary. It's a very scary thought, right? So I always remind people that when people don't want to live abusive relationships, I am quite honest. I'm quite honest, and I tell them, well, I understand why you don't want to. I understand why that it is also a difficult thing. But while you're saying you're staying for your children, I think you should also contemplate relieving your children from this trauma, you know? And because I can't tell you, I can't ask someone to leave an abusive relationship. They have to choose. I can tell you it's an unhealthy situation, but it's your choice to leave that abusive relationship. I can come up with options for you, like shelters, like, where you could apply for jobs and all that. But you living that abusive relationship is ultimately up to you. So when you're looking at women or men who are being abused, that's one thing you can share with them, that while I understand you are staying to protect your children from the stigma of coming from broken homes, you may also consider the cost at which this is coming, because this child, because of the trauma they've been exposed to, is more likely to experience or victimize others in their adulthood, or worse still, in their teenage.
I think you've given the room a lot to think about, especially with that last bit of how do we help those around us in these situations. So it's definitely a lot for us to go home with and really think about and see, if question ourselves, look back at ourselves on, are we experiencing these things or are we perpetrating these things? So I'm really happy that we have a mixed audience here, because we tend to always focus on maybe the female side of things and all, not knowing that GBV can go both ways. So it does give us a lot to really work with and think about. I think now it's time for us to have a more informal session where I'll hand over to colleagues in the office, our case coordinator, Rachel Chasakara, our case coordinator is Vuyo Ngofe, and then our investigator is Rachel Chasakara. I'll then also hand over to our GBV counselor, Yuleta, to just take us through what the office does in terms of these instances, these GBV cases. What do we do? What can we help with? How can we support you? And just, yeah, so we're going to just have a 10-minute session on that. Jane, thank you so much for your very enriching presentation, for accepting my call. I know I have a tendency to nag, but you accepted so willingly, and we really appreciate you and everything that you have shared with us today. And hopefully we can call you back to have something like this again, maybe on a broader scale, because the need is definitely there. So thank you so much, Jane. Really appreciate this.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. And well, I responded to your call because I do really enjoy engaging with people on these issues. So I should actually be thanking you for offering me the platform to hear from people, to engage with people, to learn from people as well. And yes, please do feel free to call me next time. I will run here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye.
I think let me, if it's fine with you, Chair, let me